Thank you, our viewers, for joining us again at the Politikali Konekted. I'm yours truly, Kidi Mwaga, and I will take you through the police reforms in Kenya. When we look at police reforms in Kenya, we must first go back to the very beginning. Because as they say, things don't go wrong, they start wrong. Policing in Kenya started on the wrong footing. Because remember, Kenya did not exist until April of 1888, when the colonial government, when the British government granted a trading charter to Imperial British East Africa Company, otherwise known as Ibeaco. Subsequently, Ibeaco, under William Mackinnon, went ahead and set up a militia of local men that were guarding its stores, primarily in Mombasa, and then as they built the lunatic line, in all the places where the Ibeaco had stores or warehouses. In 1906 is when we first had what was called a proper police force, when the police ordinance was enacted by the colonial government. In that police force, at the very top, of course, were white men. Below them were the Indians. And at the base of that superstructure, police superstructure, were the local population, recruits from among the local population. The way this police force was designed was to suppress local uprising, was to subjugate the local people, was to make local people compliant in providing free manual labor. And therefore, when the colonial government set up large farming, agriculture farming in the colony, in what was called the Imperial British East Africa Protectorate, that was primarily Kenya and Uganda, they relied heavily on the police force to make sure that they were able to get that free labor. As a consequence, they brought up a number of ordinances that was intended to make sure that Africans were available to provide that free labor. And who was the enforcer? The enforcer was their police force. At the top, the white man and the Indians, but then the person who executed the final order was your typical African man or African woman, but mostly they were men. If you walk through central Kenya, there is the term the home guard. The home guards were the members of the colonial police who were there to enforce the colonial laws, the colonial rules, the colonial legislations. And when the colonial government set up what was then known as the reserves, where the African land was being taken away for purposes of farming, of white settlement, and Africans were pushed into the reserves, this was largely successful because of the police force that was established by the colonial government. And so when you speak about the police during colonialism and the African people, what you see is a history of subjugation. What you see is a history of suppression. What you see is a history of oppression. The tragedy is that 60 years after independence, the script hasn't changed much. One, let us move to 1963. When we attain what, for purposes of this explain, I would call flag independence. Under that flag independence, we think that we have turned a leaf. But to our own dismay is that nothing much changed, save for who was at State House. Because very soon we realized that the same oppression that was taking place under Muzungu was continuing under the leadership of a black man. The same way police shot and killed the African people in places like Lari, in places like Hola, is the same way the police under a black president shot and killed unarmed civilians in Kisumu in 1969. It is the same way the police killed unarmed African people in a place like the Wagala massacre, what today we call the Wagala massacre. And the same way the colonial government used the police to contain political expression of the African people in Kenya, is the very same way our police has been used to contain political expression, be it in 1992 land clashes, be it in 1997 so-called land clashes, be it in 2007 post-election violence, be it in 2017 post-election chaos, be it in 2024 when the young people were rejecting a punitive finance bill. A common thread through all this is that the police are at the very center in suppressing political dissent and political expression that is not in tandem with the wishes of the political class. And so the question is, how is that so? Then we go back to the beginning. Remember we said that things don't go wrong. Things start wrong. Things start wrong because the colonial edifice that was erected in this country was an administrative edifice that was helping the colonialists to extract from this colony. And so there was need that at independence, we needed to transition from that administrative edifice into a political order that that at the very least places the interests of ordinary people at the very center. What happened is that we did not transition. Instead, with a black colonialist at State House, the system of extraction, of oppression and suppression continued unabated. The first time we came close to overthrowing that system, that administrative system that facilitates extraction from Kenya, was in 2002, when we elected President Mwai Kibaki. But then, politics of short-termism quickly moved in and distracted the leadership of NAC, as it were then. The second time we came close was in 2010 when we enacted the new constitution. But again, the politics didn't allow us to transition properly because the leadership we ended up in 2013 was a leadership that entirely did not embrace the necessary reforms we had envisaged. I say this mindful of the fact that we are in a very dicey political situation, but allow me to explain. I say that the leadership that the country got after 2013 did not believe in the new constitution. The testament to the same is that in 2014, against good judgment, the constitution, against the good judgment of the constitution, we saw a reconsolidation of power around the presidency. Remember that we had attempted to remove the hiring of the Inspector General from the hand of the president, considering that the president is a politician, and therefore sometimes he might not resist the urge to use the police force or the police, the very same way the colonialists had, the very same way his predecessors had, to manage political competition. So as a consequence, we had attempted to erect an independent commission called the National Police Commission, headed by the Inspector General himself. What happened is that we ended up with what is called the Constitutional Amendment Clause of 2014 that reconsolidated powers around the hiring of the police, of the Inspector General, into the hands of the President. As a consequence, today, we have seen how the current Inspector General is not very much different from the previous Inspector Generals. In 2014, for instance, when there was an agitation around what was called Okoa, Kenya, the then Inspector General David Kimayo attempted to proscribe the use of the word Sabasaba. It was not a different script. It was the same old script. And I remember Senator Kajwang then telling him to come and arrest all of us who were in that rally and who had chanted Sabasaba. So today, as we meet here today, we again see how the police responded to the Gen Z protest. We see how the police responded to the land dispute in Narok. To be able to engage in meaningful police reforms that are reforms that is intended to make sure that the police do not become a tool of violence for those in power, then we must go and restructure both the structure of police hiring and the systems. We must confront the structural and systemic issues around our police force. We must begin with the hiring. We must begin with the training. We must look at the welfare of the police. We must make sure that the police live like human beings. We must make sure that we give them a health care that is second to none, because they are the custodians, not only of the law and order, but they are also the most visible manifestation of state authority. The manifestation of state authority should and must not be associated with hunger, with desperation, with neglect. We must be able to house our police, men and women, in decent places. We must make sure that the question of promotion is clear and is not left to the whims of any one individual man or woman. We must also, in the same vein and breath, ensure that we focus our energy on the type of political leadership we end up with. Because to properly transition, engage in proper police reform, and transition from an administrative edifice set up by the colonialists into a political order where the police are part and parcel of this country, we must elect a leadership that is going to superintend that. And that requires that all of us becomes politically conscious, politically active, and politically vigilant. Thank you, and God bless you.